very good afternoon to everybody, and welcome very much to the afternoon session. This is the final session as I understand it. My name is Dennis Lee, as Pauline mentioned already. I'm a partner with RSM and we are in the business consulting division. We actually do help many companies, both listed, public, as well as not-for-profit, actually look at their governance matters and issues, right? So therefore, I'm going to present to you a set of slides that will talk about conflicts of interest. Okay. Interestingly enough, I think the first thing I realized after I look at this first slide is that my hair has grown a lot shorter, right, in the last couple of years. But that's interesting. I've been helping CRs with some of these governance talks over the last 4 or 5 years. This is the first time that this is being done on Zoom, right? And I hope for many of you, you're very used to actually using the Zoom features and the Zoom function, so it's not new to you, right? If you have any questions, please feel free to raise it through, the Q&A and or through the chat, and we'll do our best to answer these questions as much as possible. Okay, so managing conflicts of interest. Now, this is something very much in the spotlight these days. You have a lot of media and public attention on issues relating to corporates as well as personal issues that are triggering conflicts of interest, questions and interest. And I think this is a timely session for us to actually explore this further. I think one of the things that actually came to my mind, right, as I was preparing the slides is, why conflict of interest has always been around, right? I think conflict of interest has always been a measure to consider. But for our non-profit sector, right, conflict of interest is also very important because we also have to address the issue that, many of the board members or the council members, right, are actually volunteers, right? So conflict of interest also has to be addressed sensitively, when it comes to the matters that the boards are advising on the management committee or are helping with the management committee, right? The second thing is, I think everybody is aware, right? I mean, with the post-COVID and us Singapore coming through and easing off, some of the measures, right? It's already a challenging 2020, and it's going to be an even more challenging 2021, right? As we struggle to find our feet in terms of the purpose of our organization, the relevance of our programs, and how we deliver them through Zoom or other telecommuting means, and how we, still do our work with a low touch kind of arrangement and less physical interaction. So conflicts of interest, will definitely play a part in terms of, idea generation, in terms of partnering with other organizations, even in terms of securing funds, right, for such additional measures and additional support. So I think these are things which are really relevant given today's situation, and the current economic climate as well as the current societal climate, right? And interesting to have a think about. Okay, so I wanted to start the first session by kicking off, right, with a general poll, right? And if CRs could possibly help me, this will give us a sensing, right, of how you think conflict of interest is being taken in your organization. So I've got 3 questions, right? The first one is, how serious is conflict of interest taken in your organization? Is it something that's more of a passing remark, or is something that is very seriously taken on, right, at all levels, right? And there's a proper guidance and a proper documentation. So I would like to invite you to cast your votes so that we can have a sensing of what all the participants here's views are on conflicts of interest. That's very good. So we already have a high level of awareness in terms of conflict of interest. Thank you very much for the responses. Most of you, in fact, actually almost, 3/4 of you actually rate it as moderately high or high. So everybody is aware and sensitive to conflict of interest. Okay, that's very good, right? And I think this not only benefits you in terms of how you can further tighten or further make adjustments, fine-tuning your conflict processes, but also for the rest of the 20%, right, which have yet to start on that journey, perhaps, to document and to consider conflict of interest. Second question, please, yes. So second question is about proper means of handling conflicts of interest. This one is less complicated, it's just two questions, right? Two responses, either a yes or you have a no, right? So do you have a proper means of handling conflicts of interest? And please cast your votes. Okay, I think we would have most of the answers already in. Yes, so that is in line with the first question, right? Where most people are serious about it. So most of you have a proper means of handling it. Okay, that's very good. All right, how about the third question? So we have a final and last third question. How important will conflicts of interest be in our post-COVID recovery phase? Please don't let what I spoke about earlier influence, right? But do have a honest think and honest voting in terms of where you think COI will lie. Please cast your votes. And I believe most would have already voted. Okay. Right, so I think most people will really find it to be a very important agenda item when talking about recovery, or at least generating sustainability for your nonprofit. Thank you. Okay, so if you click on the close button, you'll be able to see the rest of my slides. Thank you. Thank you very much, Sias, for moderating this part. Now, the next question that the next part that we have. Sorry, let me just. Okay. Yes, okay, it's conflict of interest. So let's get down into the details. And you have 4 boxes here. So basically what I'm trying to explain is, where can conflicts of interest actually lie, right? So you have a situation where you have a board member, or you may perhaps have a staff, right? A permanent staff that actually has a direct interest. And this means that there is not only ownership, but there's also ability to influence, right, the decisions of a target company, or in this case particularly, it could be your vendors or your partners, right? So under such situation, I think it's quite straightforward. It's quite clear, right? That person who would be on your organization's board or in the executive management team of your organization, may be able to influence directly how this other third-party company actually deals with your organization. Okay, so that would be the first sort of category. The second sort of category is the indirect interest, where you may not, this particular person who is serving, right, in your nonprofit, be it in a volunteer manner, advisory capacity, or be in an executive capacity, may not have a direct interest, right, in that company that is providing services to your nonprofit, right? And that can be through various measures, such as other subsidiaries, or more indirect corporate relationships. But in this kind of situation, under indirect interest, there is also a potential conflict of interest. Okay. The third one is, of course, vested interest, and you have a vested interest scenario, whereby that person who is involved in your organization may not generally have a direct commercial gain or commercial benefit from dealing with, or getting his company or her company to deal with your organization, right? But there is, of course, a interested relationship, in the sense that this person may want that particular project or that particular program to succeed, right? But there may be no commercial or financially quantifiable benefit for this particular person. So that would be a vested interest scenario. And of course, deemed interest, right? Deemed interest, you may also have not direct interest, but more commonly than not, we actually refer to as, the family relationships, right? So you may have spouse, children, right? Brothers and sisters, or parents, in fact, actually related to other companies that are providing services to your organization. So I think these are the 4 different types of conflict of interest kind of scenarios that, you may potentially face, right? So that is to get everyone started in terms of where conflict of interest could potentially lie. Okay, so broadly, I think these are the categories and the scenarios, right? And ultimately, I think one thing is common is that, we need to be aware, right, of what such scenarios may present itself, right, within your organization. And then, of course, how do you then deal with such scenarios? Now, moving on to the next slide, you're very aware in terms of the impact of conflict of interest if it is not handled or managed properly. You may have the most obvious impact, which is the reputational impact, right? So to your charity or to your nonprofit, there may be a reputational impact if it is not handled properly and it becomes a public issue, right? And this can also result in certain stigma, right, associated with your company or the nonprofit. and not only in terms of further getting support or funding, or getting even beneficiaries, people to sign up or members to sign up, but it also may also impact how you are able to attract the staff, right, to actually come on board, right, to work with your organization and grow the skills of your internal resources. So I think the damage to that part is quite clear, right? That's a very direct damage. Even at the board level, you may also look at, the influence of members' judgment, compromise, and objectivity. That basically means that, at the deliberation level and the consideration level of certain decisions being made, whether to work with certain partners in program committees, whether it be, to appoint a particular company, right, for what you call the renovation works and so forth, right? These may be things which, if you don't address the conflict of interest properly, it may affect, right, the compromise and the objectivity of the whole decision-making process. Okay. The third part is a bit gray, right, in terms of the misinterpretation, right? So when things are not said clearly, right, there's a lack of clarity, a lack of transparency, and sometimes, in fact, I think we don't use the word trust that often, but right, there's a sense of mistrust, right, whenever these are things that are not flagged up properly and addressed in the right forum, right? So you may have executive team, right, working together with the volunteers or the board members, right, and if those things are not addressed clearly and upfront, there may be misinterpretation in terms of what is the objective, in terms of what is the direction that should be made. Okay, so I think these are the more common impact in terms of conflict of interest, which we should all be aware of, that it is more than just skin deep, right? There is not more than just, the outward impact that not managing a COI situation may have, right, to your company, but also internally it causes, right, a lot of disruption. So examples of conflict of interest. Now, I've listed 5 examples here, but I'm sure, there are a lot more than 5. Right, and I think we can also discuss that and highlight that throughout the course of this presentation, right? But the first one would be, of course, hiring a relative or friend as an employee or as a vendor, right? So I'm sure we've all come across this before, right? In terms of how do you manage a situation like that, right? I always ask the question, right? Is good talent that hard to find? But of course, in certain situations, may warrant certain talent because of certain skill sets or certain experience. But I guess the question is whether or not there is a robust process to evaluate, the suitability of that talent, as well as whether it's a robust and transparent and fair process of hiring, right? So I think this is one dicey situation when it comes to conflict of interest. The second one, of course, buying and selling of goods from a family business may not be necessarily a family business, maybe a corporation, but in such a situation, right? If that person who is making the decision has some sort of linkage to that business, right, then it may trigger a conflict of interest scenario, right? The third one is, of course, something that, can pop up from time to time, personal relationships with subordinates or personal indiscretions, which we have seen, in the papers over the last, couple of years, right? Such situations also compromise, the integrity and the level of objectivity in terms of decision making, right? It can also affect in terms of the staff morale and so forth, especially, right, if certain things such as approvals and so on are not taken in the right light, right? I think personal relationships with subordinates is certainly a very dangerous issue, right? Volunteerism, okay, volunteering, and this I think largely applies to board members. You may have board members that serve on other boards, and those boards are boards of non-profits, which are also providing two types of programs. They can be programs or projects which are complementary to your company's projects, or it may be projects that are competing, right? But in either case, I think it's good to have a clear, proper means of managing this potential conflict, right? To make sure, right, that things are done in the best interest of the beneficiaries as well as the organization, okay? And the last one is, of course, receiving goods and services as beneficiaries. So basically, the person who is perhaps is the subject of the conflict of interest may, in fact, actually be a beneficiary or be receiving, right, those treatments, right, or those funding or those support that is offered by your organization, there may be a direct conflict of interest. Is basically self-interest. Okay, so these are just some examples of conflict of interest, and I'm sure many of you have actually had some experience, dealing with such situations. Okay, so I think at this juncture, I want to go to in terms of where the law stands on conflict of interest. If you look at Section 156 of the Companies Act, right? Why I bring in Companies Act also because some of your charities or your non-profits, right, maybe companies registered as companies limited by guarantee, right? And Section 156 also says that the director of a company who is interested in a transaction or a proposed transaction shall declare the nature of the interest. So which means something that could potentially push through, or is something that is about to be firm up or is already firm up, right? So in those particular instances, I think Companies Act takes it pretty seriously when it comes to, right, the declaration and the disclosure aspects and responsibilities. Second part of Section 156 also talks about key appointment holders, including directors and CEOs, right? When they actually face a potential conflict, they should have a written notice to the company setting out the fact, nature, character, and extent. So we're talking about, justification here, right? So I think Companies Act actually makes it very clear. And of course, we put down there in the bottom, right, some of the highlights in terms of a breach. And when such a breach occurs, what are the penalties that are accrued? It could be fines, it may be imprisonment, it may even be disqualification to acting as a director, right? So these are, just demonstrates to you the severity and the importance in terms of why conflict of interest is a key subject. The second part is, of course, the code, right? Our good and friendly code also talks about the conflict of interest for board members and employees, right? And they should be acting in the best interest of organization. Now, notice here the code also has COI covering both, right, the board as well as the staff, right? So I think in terms of, staff, we can argue that there are many staff at different levels, right? But I'm sure certainly conflict of interest got to apply to the key staff and decision makers, most importantly, because they are the ones who are able to act on behalf, right, of the organization. So acting in the best interest of organization, clearing policies and procedures should be set to declare, prevent, and address any potential conflict scenario, okay? So I think the code is definitely a good guideline, right, to talk about in terms of conflict of interest, and it sets out certain expectations, right? Some of it also covers remuneration and salaries, right, for executives especially, right? And it also covers procedures to deal with board members that have potential conflicts arising from any of the 3 bullet points: business transactions, interest in other organizations, as well as interest in the charity's suppliers, service users, or beneficiaries, right? So it's a catch-all, okay? In addition to that, of course, we have other matters which are relating to situations where board members should not vote on the matter. So if there is a conflict of interest, the board member should recuse himself, right? And the final decision or the justification as to why certain things were selected or certain companies were not selected, right, should be recorded and should be minuted down. So I think for purposes of documentation, right, and proper record keeping, this should always be, something that you practice, right? The code also talks about employment of employees with family relations, and this is something I mentioned earlier. One of the potential or common conflict of interest scenarios, whether or not there's a proper HR process, and that HR process addresses the identification of such potential conflict scenarios, as well as how that process is then followed diligently to make sure that they arrive at the right decision, okay, as to whether to hire or not to hire, okay? So I think this is the good guidance from the code, right? And we wanted to go into a couple of case studies. So these are just reminders to you, right? And these are actually publicly available information that's happened over the last couple of years, right? So we have the first case study, which is on fundraising dinner. And fundraising dinners, we're right about the time where everybody starts to raise to organize their fundraising dinners. These days, it may be more, online or limited physical interaction, but this is a common feature of nonprofits. And in such situations, the chairman of this committee also runs an external event company, right? And to avoid the conflict of interest, the chairman actually recused himself from the discussion and decision. But subsequently, it was evaluated. It's found that this particular company that the chairman is associated with offered the best rates, right? And the a contract was actually awarded to this company. However, I think subsequent to that, the secretariat of the committee actually expressed or came up to say that the chairman had actually done some meddling in terms of the quotes, and was asking the executives to submit multiple services at higher offer prices, basically obviously to make it such that his organization that is associated with is the most competitive. Okay, so a couple of questions for you. Was the conflict of interest well handled in this particular case? I think the answer is obvious, right? But the question is whether or not we have to make the distinction between what is happening on form, which is how the documentation shows that the chairman actually recruits himself, versus what happened in substance, which is behind the scenes, what was actually going on, right? And these are situations that can be quite difficult to actually unravel, really depending on the mechanisms to flag these things out. Second question, excuse me, is about how could the situation be managed better, right? Was the due diligence process on the evaluation done, properly, such that the competing parties were evaluated on fair grounds and common grounds, for that matter, right? It begs the question in terms of the rigor of the due diligence process, and of course, what should happen next, right? In terms of such a situation, should we stop the tender? Should we re-tender? Right? Should we go back and reevaluate what has happened, and also what is the position of the company in terms of such an abuse, right? So I think these are questions which certainly would be triggered in such a scenario. Okay. The next case study is about mismanagement relating to loans, right, in financial matters, right? So sometimes we have charities management that was investigated for mismanagement. The trustee and the secretary of the management committee actually go offline and they get a loan, sizable loan, without the management committee approval, right? And as such, right, there was a written loan that was made, an agreement made with the lender, but without the management committee's knowledge. Furthermore, the secretary was also a signatory, right? One of two signatories, which was able then to commit the company to large transactions, right, with other vendors that he was also related to. And also there's a lack of competitive quotes obtained by the charity. So you look at this whole story, I think a little bit on the scary side, I mean, in terms of what can happen, right? But we then have to ask ourselves, I mean, what is the propensity for board override in this particular case? It seems that, there was a lot of board override, right? It also seems that, the secretary, could the secretary actually have done something better, or at least the committee could have done something better? Right? Was there a proper ground-up assessment, right, done of the kind of transaction? We are looking at $750,000 here, sizable transactions. Should have been something that was alerted through the finance committee, right? Is it something that they had a proper due process to have a declaration, and also alerts for large transactions? How would this then, help to detect such particular cases where you have a board override? Right, so this is a second case study which talks about conflict of interest also, and especially not to mention the fact that the secretary is related to two vendors. There's a direct interest there. Okay. In terms of case study 3, and this is the last case study, of course, this is one where the charity, the CEO was also accused, right, of not being managing public relations well. He also appointed one of the close friends to secure a sizable contract, right? And the contract worst case was actually not done well, right? And there was actually no recourse done by the company, right? So I think this is again another famous case, right? But it begs the question: how robust is your tender process? Do you have a proper tender process? Is this something that's instituted, especially for large amounts, right? And is there a process then to declare conflict of interest before, right, rather than during or after the whole tender process is done and tender is awarded, right? Has the lines between doing good and doing the right thing also been blurred? Sometimes you may have situations where you need to procure, buy, or appoint someone on an urgent basis, and I think we can all agree, that these are realistic scenarios that we may have to face. But the question is then, how much can you do the evaluation in terms of what sort of detail? And where do you draw the line in terms of balancing, between cost and quality, as well as looking at the conflict scenarios? And what kind of recourse does the company have in such a situation? Are they able to, do a stop order? Are they able to issue liquidated damages, or get the company to do a rectification? Or is there even, a performance evaluation process done from time to time to make sure that such issues, are stopped or nipped in the bud, right? And we can do a rectification process, right? So these are just some of the thoughts that come to my mind in terms of a case study like this. Okay, so what can we actually learn from such cases? I think it's quite clear you need to have a balance, right, between preventive measures, measures that create awareness at the board and executive level, as well as detective measures. Okay, some of the preventive measures would be your conflict of interest framework. The detective measures may be, assurance checks, independent reviews done, by auditors, right? Even mechanisms, right, to detect conflict situations such as background checks, and searches and so on and so forth, right? So I think there has to be a balance in terms of, the kind of measures you put in place, right? Definitely we need to have, the machinery still has to keep on moving. You still need to have, the work, the good work that all your charities do, right, continue. But how can we put in place such measures in order to make sure there's reasonable, control over conflict of interest, potential breaches, okay? Level of preparedness, ask yourself these questions. Okay, there are 6 boxes here. Is there a process for you to declare this annually? Right? Is there a clear delegation matrix? Who makes decisions in the event that there's a need to escalate it up? Is there a mandatory declaration process? And how, to what extent or reach does it cover? Just the board members, or the volunteers, or even the staff, right? Is there an updated list of service vendors so that we know how to do those checks to make sure that, there's no potential conflict behind the scenes? Right? Is there a registry that is managed, right? I think some people say the secretary should actually manage those registries, and it's a good idea to think about how those registries are managed and how often do you get a declaration or search done, right? At the onset of appointment, or is it, every couple of years, or whenever there's a major change, or if there's a notification, right, from the person involved. And also disciplinary actions, what are the kind of consequences that can apply, right, when somebody actually breaches this conflict, and are they severe enough? Non-profits operating in a post-COVID society. I just mentioned about this at the beginning of the talk. And there are many measures that I think we need to consider, especially as these 5 points are laid out, considerations in terms of a post-COVID society where, charities, we're always competing for a limited donor dollar, right, or funding dollar for that matter. So how do we make sure that conflict of interest measures are actually well considered? I think it's good to have the tone at the top. It's also definitely good to have everybody generally aware of a conflict position. But when it comes to this, you have to consider the kind of environment we are living in. So in terms of health and safety, right, there are more spending in terms of screening, in terms of health supplies, medical supplies, in terms of checks and so on. And of course, to meet the regulatory requirements as a minimum standard, right? So how much do we spend on that, right? And how are we spending on that? And who are we getting help from? What kind of advice are we getting from? I think we just need to be aware of this, right, in the context of a post-COVID environment. The next thing, of course, we talk about cash flow and sustainability chains. So we talk about where do we find, the ways to manage our cost? How do we make sure that we are sustainable for the next couple of years, right? Looking at our programs, looking at our funding sources, looking at the outcome and output of our projects, right? And whether or not these are attracting more and more fundings, right? So I think that's one aspect that we need to do, especially when it comes to taking of advice and looking at sources as well as exploring various options. Preserving jobs, definitely important, but we talk about reskilling, upskilling, and preserving jobs got to do with digitalization as well. There's a lot of transformative efforts I know that are taking place behind the scenes. How are these then helping the organization, right, to skill up our people, to scale up and skill them up, right? And of course, there will be training, there will be equipping them of skills with technology and also buying of capital expenditure. So with such things, there will definitely be certain exposure and we need to think about conflict of interest in such context. And of course, donations as well, right? How are we getting the donations? Where are these coming from? In fact, these days we talk about e-donations because hardly do we have a case where people just put it in the donation box now. It's all electronically done. How do we make sure that any potential conflicts are flagged up in such a situation? Okay. So not only in Singapore, but I think globally, right, as we all battle with this pandemic, conflict of interest as a topic is also very pertinent, right, in other parts of the world, right? These are just snippets of commentary from the press. You have conflict of interest talk about in the UK, right, in terms of how the treatments are being developed, and those people who are sitting on advisory boards, how such positions may even trigger a conflict of interest, especially if they are working with healthcare companies, right? So I think these are things which are very common. And in fact, the fight against COVID is also triggering such potential conflicts, right? Obviously for financial gain. Okay. Don't reinvent the wheel. This is what we always say. SSI has a very good guidance available on the web, right? Sample conflict of interest disclosure statements. There are some of the basic things that are already here, right? Including on the right side, you will see, right, some of the basis for explaining why there's a conflict and what do you do and how have you escalated it up, right? So I think these are good things, and I presume most of the 75% of you who think that conflict of interest is a very important thing and needs to be well managed, right? I'm sure that you have some form of guidance or checklist to enable someone with a potential conflict to step forth, right, and make that disclosure. Okay, so the key takeaways, right? Look at whether you have a guidance framework, right? Whether you're using the right checklist, whether you have the right policies, right? And how these are rolled out both at the board level as well as the staff level. Is there a level of training and orientation that is actually embedded in your organization, right? Is this orientation done for new board members? And for training purposes, is this done on a regular basis for staff as well as sensitive positions? Escalation process, is there an escalation process? Who needs to take the right position in terms of whether there's a conflict or not, right? Declarations and mindset and awareness, and of course tone at the top, because I think those are very important, right? The tone at the top and the position, right, that the leaders of the organization takes in terms of conflict of interest will definitely influence how the staff and the support actually see the conflict of interest and actually tackle or alert, right, higher up members in terms of what the conflict could actually entail. Okay, so I think these are the key takeaways, right? Good summary for you all. And before I end, I just wanted to say, in closing comments, right? When in doubt, whether there's a conflict of interest, I think we should consult. Okay, so I think that would actually resonate with many of you who have good conflict of interest practices out there. And I come to the end of my presentation. I want to say thank you, stay safe, and of course, keep healthy. Thank you.